Hoverflies. This talk is a visual guide to these vital pollinators, how to recognise them and how their varied forms and life cycles fit into the ecology of the natural world. Now, I'm not an expert on the subject, but I think I know enough to give a reasonable insight into this fascinating group of insects. Before I start off with the basics about hoverflies, I should probably add that I will try to avoid pronouncing too many names because I'll probably make a mess of them. I'm certainly not an expert at Latin, but I'll do my best where appropriate. Moving on to the basics then, as I said, let's look at how you'll recognise a hoverfly. So this slide explains how hoverflies come into the order of Diptera, and how Diptera have just 2 wings rather than 4 as most flying insects have, and how the hind wings have evolved into whole hairs. We've got about 280 species of hoverfly in the UK. It varies for several reasons. For a start, we may lose species, just a few. We may gain some from the continent. There are some that may get split, and there are some that might get merged. So hoverflies are harmless to most animals, but their larval forms are predatory on other insects such as aphids. So this is fantastic natural pest control for gardeners. And as far as pests are concerned, probably the only one that could reasonably be regarded as a pest is Merodon equestris. As far as this talk is concerned, I'm really concentrating on Cumbrian hoverflies where I'm based and limiting it to the years subsequent to 2015 for various reasons that I won't go into. Anyway, in that period, at least up to the end of 2021, I've got about 560 records, which is a reasonable number, and about 70 separate species there, which is about a quarter of the total, which isn't too bad considering in one area you're never going to get them all anyway. Some of them are quite rare and in very specific parts of the country. And that's it. Now, I've already shown you a couple of pictures of hoverflies, but that's not really going to help you, is it, to have a good sense of what is a hoverfly and what is a bee or a wasp or so forth. Now, this happens to be one of the most common hoverflies in the UK. Has an English name of the marmalade hoverfly, as you can see from the banded colours on the abdomen. But it shows you the basics, as I explained on the left hand side. A sort of rather flattened abdomen, the fairly long legs, a fairly solid beast with quite big eyes, and the wings, they are a very good guide. So the top illustration is of another Diptera. Remember, they are members of the Diptera order, but you can see quite clearly the difference between a typical wing of an ordinary fly and the hoverfly, which has got this vena spuria or spurious vein and the wing, and it really is quite distinctive, although you may well need a magnifying glass to spot it, or a good camera. This one definitely fits into the category of a standard hoverfly with the black abdomen, the yellow bars, and it's on a flower. But you can't really see the spurious vein at this point. Now, remembering what I said before, this is a close-up of the same hoverfly, and you can see on the left-hand wing the spurious vein that sort of goes in a sort of diagonal angle towards the bottom left. So there you have it. It's quite distinctive if you can get close enough or you've got good eyesight. A side view of a typical hoverfly. The point of this is pointing out the whole tear. It's got one on each side, and they're rather like gyroscopes, and they do seem to help it hover and move backwards and forwards. I think there are quite a few sensory organs in the organ. Here's another sort of standard middle of the road sort of hoverfly, really quite a bright species, and it shows you the relatively flattened abdomen, slightly broader at least across rather than deep, and the hairs rather than bristles in the body. So hopefully you're getting the sort of idea of what many hoverflies look like at least. So this is a non-yellow hoverfly. Instead of shiny yellow bands or what have you, it has semi-rectangular areas that are quite dull in appearance, and this is termed dusting. Another noteworthy feature of this hoverfly is you'll see, since the top view, that the eyes are almost touching. Now that's a feature of males. More or less exclusively you'll see that males have larger eyes than females, so the equivalent female of this would have eyes where there's quite a significant separation at the top of the head. This male hoverfly then is actually sitting on a ramson leaf, wild garlic, and that's probably because, in fact, the larval form of the hoverfly utilises the roots, the nodules of wild garlic. Here's another more or less totally black hoverfly. The name is Courtship variabilis, and why I've included this is because it's rather intriguing. The side view of the head shows a chin and what appears to be a mouth and a nose. Of course it isn't really quite like that, but it's just remarkable, like a human profile from the side. So I'm starting to mix things up a bit just to sort of give you a better idea of what is a hoverfly and what isn't a hoverfly. So this is a tachinid fly, which belongs to a group that are parasitic on Lepidoptera, and you'll see from the fly that regardless of the apparent absence of the spurious vein, it's got huge long bristles, so this is definitely not a hoverfly. Well, this has got not such obvious long bristles, but it's certainly got bristles. And it's rather characteristic of many species of flies that are regarded as a bit of a nuisance, the blue bottles and the green bottles and so forth. So I think you can quite happily say this is certainly not a hoverfly. But this is considerably different from the previous examples, and it certainly doesn't fit the standard appearance of a hoverfly. A very narrow waisted abdomen, a rather peculiar thing that one might be forgiven for thinking was an ichneumon wasp, for instance, but it is actually a hoverfly, although you can't see the spurious vein, of course, from this point. But the standard text from perhaps 20 years ago would say that this was a common hoverfly found in scrubby areas and hedges and what have you. In fact, in the last 10 years, I've hardly seen it at all. And then I see that in fact it's significantly declining. Now I feel you might be getting a bit of an idea, a bit of expertise on what is a hoverfly and what isn't. So here's quite a tricky one. It's got the right sort of flattened abdomen and it's got yellowish bands, no obvious bristles. So do you think it's a hoverfly? Well, it isn't actually. It's got very peculiar antennae, rather like antlers, and it's very large. It's about 25 millimeters long and no sign of a spurious vein. In fact, it is the dark giant horsefly, Tabanus pseudeticus. It's not known to bite people, but it's pretty intimidating stuff. So far I've shown you what a typical hoverfly looks like and how to readily distinguish the more obvious ones at least from other similar flies. What I haven't shown you so far is how a surprising number of hoverflies look like some solitary bees, social wasps, etc. Now that comes under the name of Batesian mimicry, the definition of which: a form of protective mimicry in which an unprotected species, in brackets the mimic, closely resembles an unpalatable or harmful species and therefore is similarly avoided by predators. The close resemblance between certain harmless flies and stinging bees is an example. and it's named after the British naturalist H.W. Bates. So I'll go on to explain a bit more. I probably should say at the outset that these are my examples of something that looks like something else, and perhaps other people might disagree. In some cases I might well agree with you. They're not brilliant examples, but there again, it's not up to us to decide whether it's a mimic or not. It's up to the predator, and we can't say how successful that is or not. In this particular example, the one on the left is an obvious hoverfly, and the one on the right is actually, well, it's not actually a wasp, it's a solitary bee. It's a group, an armada, that are kleptoparasites on other solitary bees, particularly the Andrena mining bees. And so reasonable mimic, but I think you could say I could do better than that. This one is a hoverfly, but I would regard it as one of the definitely better mimics of social wasps. I think it's really a very impressive mimic. So this one, it isn't in Cumbria, as you can see. That's not my single record. I just happened to get this slightly blurred photograph. I think it was actually in Suffolk a few years ago. Now this one is found in Cumbria, although it's not exactly common. A very distinctive species. This one is a female. You can see that the eyes are quite reasonably well separated. It's got very distinctive marks on its wing and a strange dent on its abdomen. I cannot fathom the reason for that, but never mind. But it's a pretty good mimic of many wasps. I should say immediately that this isn't a hoverfly. Could well be, couldn't it? But it does look pretty odd with very long antennae with a slightly club shape there. In fact, it is a fly, it's not a wasp, but it's of a different family within the Diptera order, Conopidae. And these are, well, perhaps not that common, and the larvae are parasites on bumblebees. And the thing to say with this one is I'm not comparing one mimic with a hoverfly. In fact, they are both hoverflies, but it just illustrates the fact that the form of a hoverfly can vary through weather changes and no doubt other things. Some can be melanic, but in this case, the one on the left is an early summer variety and the one on the right is a late summer variety. And you can see there are similarities, but they are quite different. One could be forgiven for thinking they are actually different species. So I am trying to get back to this standard format of a hoverfly on the left, and what it appears to be mimicking is the species on the right, which in this case is Bombus hypnorum, which is otherwise known as the tree bumblebee. And it's quite a good mimic actually. The one on the left, the hoverfly, does vary in its form actually. It does appear to mimic different species of bumblebees, which is quite intriguing. How does it do that? I'm not sure there's a satisfactory explanation. And the hoverfly is not exactly that common. It seems to be found only in very low numbers. So we've got a rather strange looking hoverfly on the left with a rather bulbous hind femur and rather odd antenna with sort of bulbous ends, and what it seems to be mimicking is a red-tailed bumblebee. In fact, it's quite a good mimic for the male, which is on the right. And the hoverfly, well, it's actually quite an unusual one. It's let's say it's mainly a southern species, and it likes sallows, catkins, blackthorn blossom, etc. And as far as Cumbria is concerned, there have been very few records in the last 20 years, say. It has actually been, I think, rated as nationally rare, but I think that has been revised and it's perhaps not as rare as thought, but it's certainly quite unusual. So for people that have a basic familiarity with bumblebees, this looks a pretty good mimic for a white-tailed bumblebee. But it is a hoverfly and it's a male, as you can see, with the eyes more or less touching on the top of the head. This particular one has a pretty hazardous, quite amazing lifestyle. It lays its eggs in both social wasp and bumblebee nests, and the female has this interesting reflex so that if it's actually stung, it will lay its eggs anyway. And the larvae live on nest debris. Again, this species of hoverfly does vary somewhat. Here's another example, and in this case it's a female, as you can see from the eyes being widely separated. Looks more like a mimic of a buff-tailed bumblebee. You'll notice interesting features as the antenna coming out the front of its head, incredibly bristly, those long, thin features that are called arista and unusually hairy. And these species tend to, as with related species, sort of, I would say, lurk around on leaves and what have you. I dare say that's a consequence of the lifestyle, the fact they're probably looking for bumblebees or wasps to follow back to their nest and lay eggs. Going back to the one on the left, again, you'll probably recognise I said it was a mimic of a white-tailed bumblebee, and the one on the right is a really excellent example of a red-tailed bumblebee. Fantastic, that is a really good mimic. So this one clearly looks a bit different in that it isn't an obvious mimic of a bumblebee. It's fairly unhairy and more sort of a clear black colour and a very pale yellow. And what this one does is it specialises in laying its eggs in social wasp nests, where its larvae probably live on nest debris. And it's also a very large hoverfly, probably one of our largest. And when it's not laying eggs, it likes brambles and umbellifers. Going back to the idea of a hoverfly on the left and what it's probably trying to mimic on the right, the one on the left is a somewhat unusual species of hoverfly. It's fairly widespread, but I've only come across it once, I think, in Cumbria, and there are a few records, but they tend to be in this sort of central areas within woodlands. That probably explains why I haven't found it. And then the one on the right is the Miscellaneous species of wasp. Now these happen to be notable enemies of hoverflies, and I'll go into more detail on that a bit later on. The hoverfly on the left is one of those excellent mimics, particularly of honeybees. So that on the right is a honeybee. Perhaps the comparison would be better if the honeybee didn't have a huge sac of pollen. If you can imagine taking that away, the hind legs are really quite similar, and otherwise it's a really good mimic. I suppose you recognise the name Eristalis tenax. In fact, it is the same species as the previous picture, but a rather more hairy example, perhaps related to the fact that this is really late winter, 10th March. In fact, these hoverflies can be seen more or less any month of the year, but you're pretty unlikely to see them in the winter months. Perhaps down in the southwest of the UK, you're more likely to see them. Now back to the obvious mimics of bees or wasps. This one on the left is a very good mimic of the red wasp on the right, and notice even the wings of the hoverfly are tinted sort of an orangey red. This takes mimicry to a new level. Quite extraordinary mimic. I think from a distance more or less anyone would be fooled by this one. So the hoverfly is on the left, and it's a pretty hairy one, so it's obviously mimicking some sort of bumblebee, and the bumblebee on the right is a common carder. And in fact, on the left, the hoverfly has two forms, which is quite intriguing, and they were at one time regarded as separate species. So this is the other form of the previous hoverfly on wild garlic this time. What I think is rather interesting is that this isn't mimicking a common carder bumblebee, but more like a tree bumblebee, in which case it is an extraordinary mimic as well. Once again, I've slightly bent the rules. I was really trying to keep the theme to hoverflies within Cumbria. I've already shown you one which wasn't, so here's the only other one that isn't in Cumbria. It's one of those two red circles on the west coast of Scotland, north of the Great Glen, and mine is just to the south of Skye, and it shows you how rare this beast is, at least recorded in the northern quadrant of Scotland. And I just happened to come across it in a nice area of wood near Arisaig, and just happened to spot it landing on a tree in a dark wood and managed to get some photographs. So that was a very pleasing recording of quite a rare hoverfly. Well, that's the end of my examples of Batesian mimicry with hoverflies. I thought it was probably worth considering acoustic mimicry. I'm not alone in thinking that. There has been some research, and I've looked at it and come to the conclusion that there is no clear message, that there is no indication that hoverflies mimic other species like bumblebees or what have you. Admittedly, sounds do vary, and it's just a mixed message, and there isn't really, as I said, no clear conclusion. But next time I'm going to play a few short, well, one actually short sound clip which happens to have a very short buzz of what I think was common cardabee. I didn't notice it at the time, immediately followed by a high pitched buzz of a hoverfly. But I wouldn't take the hoverfly buzz as distinctive. They're not probably all like that, whereas typically bumblebees do tend to be a lower pitch, except when they're cornered, they need to be aggressive because they're being attacked or so forth. This is a pretty brief section of my talk. Hoverflies are not generally regarded as pests. Perhaps the larval stages might in a few cases, and I'll quickly go through that in a moment. So this is one that's been labelled as a pest species of hoverfly, and unfortunately it's believed to have been introduced into this country in the second half of the 19th century. I don't know why, but that appears to be a fact, and there are with this particular species several forms and intermediate forms. So looking at why it's a pest, well, it's a sort of horticultural pest, you might say. It's also known as the large narcissus fly or large bulb fly, and following on from that name, it attacks daffodils, at least the larval form does, and other similar bulbs. But it's only seen as a problem in horticultural areas, not surprising unless you happen to have a lot of narcissi in your garden, and they suffer maybe 1 year or two, and you might think, well, I wonder what caused that. And the larvae live for as much as 300 days in the bulb before pupating in the soil. Now here is another example, a different form of the same species, the narcissus fly, and they do tend to sort of hang around like this. It's sort of characteristic behaviour, it seems. I've seen it quite a lot. And here is a third example. You've probably got the message by now. Notice the hind legs, a distinctive spur on the apex of the hind tibia. And again, it's sort of lurking, one might say, and it just looks as though it's going to peep over this piece of vegetation to see what's going on the other side. So hoverflies have not really got many specific enemies, but I'm going to show you a couple of examples. Now here is a particularly striking example of a hoverfly. It's got an enormous long proboscis, and so it's very distinctive. But it's lying there dead with its, well, let's say its neck's broken for the sake of simplicity. And I'm actually rather confusing you here because I'm showing a couple of photographs not in time sequence. So the next one will explain, or at least attempt to, what is going on. And this in fact is the first scene I came across, where the dead hoverfly was lying on a leaf and straddled by this Ectemnius species of wasp. And I wondered what was going on. I assumed that the wasp had killed the hoverfly. In fact, these are the real enemies of hoverflies. And it was rather puzzling that the wasp didn't carry off the hoverfly. I am assured by experts it is capable of it, although it's a pretty hefty hoverfly, and it would normally carry it back to its nest, which would probably be a tube or a hole in wood, and put the hoverfly in and lay eggs, and the eggs will hatch out to larvae and they'll eat the hoverfly. So that's really helps is essential for the life cycle of the wasp. But I'm now going to show you something else. So this is the odd thing that the wasp was doing while it was straddling the hoverfly. It appears to be manipulating tiny bits of pollen, which is pretty weird. No obvious explanation for this. So this is my theory for what it's worth, because nobody's offered a better one, is that the wasp killed the hoverfly and it was exhausted and decided it couldn't carry the hoverfly back to its nest. So it laid eggs on it anyway. And it maybe was trying to get a bit of energy from pollen. Those are the tiny irregular white areas, white blotches on the thorax, and the obviously spherical, more or less perfectly formed ones are the wasp's eggs. The wasp's ovipositor was noticeably sticking out, so I think that was further evidence that it had just recently laid eggs. So it's rather bizarre behaviour, but I think it was simply too exhausted to carry a large hoverfly back to its nest. So this is another sort of thing that kills hoverflies fairly commonly, and you can see on the top of the abdomen there's this white blotchy area, and that's a fungus. So I have seen that on many hoverflies and other flies in the Diptera order, and it's probably a rather old hoverfly because there are chunks out the wing, so something's going to get it in the end, even if it's not a typical predator. In this case, it's a fungus that's going to kill it. So most hoverfly species depend on flowers, not all. Some seem to get grains, pollen, what have you, from grasses, and I've just sort of tried to describe here the various adaptations of hoverflies depending on what they specialise in. Some have got a very long proboscis, the mouth parts that stick out, such as the Ringia campestris I'd shown you just previously, and some, as you see, digest nectar and pollen, and some take honeydew, which is the excretion from aphids. But a very good place anyway to look for hoverflies is flowers. Go to a decent patch of flowers in your own garden, because that's probably the best place where you're going to find them, actually, because so many flowers have disappeared from meadows, they hardly exist sadly anymore. This is just a simple reminder of the basic parts of a flower, and a great place to start looking for hoverflies is go to some umbellifers like this. In fact, you'll find an amazing variety of insect species on such groups of flowers. It doesn't really show up well here, but you can probably, if you look carefully, spot several hoverflies and other flying insects. And generally I take photographs of things like this, and it's only subsequently when I magnify photographs I find so many other things that I never spotted with the naked eye. And you know, they're an incredibly useful area to look for a whole range of insects. Well, you'll probably recognise this very distinctive looking hoverfly. I've already shown it, Ringia campestris. Certainly seems pretty common and widespread, especially where cows are present. It likes deep flowers such as red campion and bugle, woodland edges and hedgerows. Now the thing is that the larvae breed in cow dung. It does probably use dung from other species. Unfortunately, cow dung tends to be contaminated because cattle are wormed, and this treatment comes through in the dung and then has an impact on the ecology of the dung as it's broken down by invertebrates. These tend to be killed by the insecticide. Consequently, the dung is not recycled very well. It also means that it damages the life cycle of this hoverfly, which is also significantly declining. So this is what a healthy ecosystem in dung looks like, with lots of holes, and various things can be actually seen, various invertebrates in the holes, and there's a fly at bottom right. There's a lot going on here. This is what it should look like, but most dung nowadays doesn't look like anything like it. It looks dead. And here is some dung that's a somewhat different colour, but it's still healthy. There's lots going on. There's an obvious large dung beetle and quite a lot of mites of different sizes, which might be different species. But anyway, this is what it should look like. And this is that hoverfly again. This is the one that's suffering from the contamination of dung. And there it is with its mouth parts, its proboscis, out probing a Loncorello flower. I'm now going to show a sequence of photographs showing it sticking its proboscis out. It's amazing how long it extends, and cleaning it. So here it is extended somewhat, but not absolutely maximum extent yet. And now it's using its front legs to clean the proboscis. Now you can see the full extent of the proboscis, and it's prodigiously long, dare I say. And now it's starting to retract the proboscis. So changing the subject somewhat, this is a little section about pollination, and the hoverfly pictured there is an obvious mimic of a common carder. Here is an interesting pie chart showing the various proportions of pollinating insects as their contribution towards the total amount in the pie. Bumblebees and other wild bees, as you can see, actually contribute the vast majority of pollination in a typical wild environment. Honeybees in a typical wild environment, very little actually. Well, they're not everywhere for a start, and also they have fixed length tongues, which limits their usefulness, and so on. In fact, hoverflies are vastly more useful as pollinators. And then there are other flies. Butterflies and moths do some pollination, and there are various other things, including, say, various sorts of beetle, and that's about it. But it's a vital process here. And this slide illustrates the incredible importance of insect pollination for our food. I'll just let you absorb the facts for a few moments before moving on. Pollination isn't about pollinating the obvious food crops. There's more to it than that. Just consider if we didn't have pollinators like these hoverflies, two different species, we wouldn't get things like brambles in the autumn to pick. And here is a hoverfly we've already seen before. It looks like a common carder mimic, and it's on a bramble flower. And of course, there's not just brambles, there are so many things in the wild that aren't crops, such as wild flowers. So if we didn't have pollination, it would be disastrous. So far, I've only mentioned hoverflies pollinating flowers, but actually it's broader than that. Grasses are involved as well. They have pollen. At one time it was assumed that grasses were just pollinated by a wind process, but in fact some are pollinated by hoverflies as well. This is an interesting example of a species that does pollinate grasses. Look at the body and the legs of this hoverfly, and you'll see that it's covered with tiny speckles, which are grains of pollen. And with this species, and actually several others in this and the related genus, are believed to be significant pollinators. As I said before, it had been assumed that plantains, for instance, were exclusively wind pollinated, but observations have been made early in the morning by some dedicated people visiting them that this process does actually happen, and they also visit grasses and sedges, so it's much more complicated than we originally thought. So this is the second of 3 pictures showing how it's gradually cleaning its body up and getting rid of most of the pollen. And now most of the pollen has gone, there's very little left, and it's very kindly raised its wings up and lowered its abdomen, so you can see this amazing sort of inky blue rather than black that the abdomen is coloured in. And here is a hoverfly that uses catkins as a food source early in the spring. Moving on to a crucial consideration of how hoverflies are doing and how the future looks for them. This is one aspect of my talk that probably deserves a talk on its own. It's to do with insect declines and extinctions. Now there is a thing called post-note system on the UK Parliament website which deals with a huge range of subjects and analyses them and is meant to produce a balanced report looking at various aspects. Well, this one is not at all. It is quite dreadful. It does, the post-note report delivers a message of confusion with a huge number of references, some of which are actually wrong, and fails to differentiate between quality reports providing clarity and those that seem to deliberately sow the seeds of doubt. It is almost impossible to gain sense of what is really happening, and I think it's a disgrace. It also succeeds in completely muddying the water on the subject of insect biodiversity declines. Looking at that, there's that quote there about bees and hoverflies and dramatic losses between 1950s and 1980s, but losses have slowed since the 1990s. Certainly that they have declined in that period, but they've also not slowed since the 1990s, so that is simply wrong. And in fact, there have been significant declines before the 1950s, and probably since the 1920s there have been huge changes before we were really recording things properly. That is a very significant point, and there's evidence that there's a serious decline actually occurring now in the past decade. And then looking at the whole position of how people perceive these changes, because that does make a difference, not just the stats, but how they perceive it. So people will have this shifting baseline syndrome where they think a particular situation is such and such at a certain point in time, and they'll notice the declines, but then a next generation comes along and doesn't realise what it was like before. So we don't realise, we haven't got a feeling of the whole massive scale of declines. So this is an important report from the Netherlands, not the UK. I'll move on to that in a moment, and describes forest hoverfly community collapse in a Dutch wood. Now it's isolated from farmland, so one would hope that the sort of effects from farmland is ignored effectively, and it does show this huge decrease in abundance of hoverflies of 80% in that period. But it's not just a straight decline. Until the 1990s there was a fairly straightforward decrease of 11% per year, but mainly in nationally rare species, and then there was some stabilisation for some reason that hasn't really been explained, and then there was a second period of strong declines which is now carrying on now. So this is the current best assessment of how hoverflies are doing in the UK, and compiled by a huge amount of data, so it's pretty reliable, and it again shows this interesting double dip where things are declining and then there's a slight levelling out and then a more steep decline yet again, and this is what it's doing right up to the present day, steeply declining. And in fact the majority of hoverfly species are decreasing, and it looks at a pretty grim and serious situation. I'm now going to look at a few examples of hoverflies that are declining in different ways in the different circumstances with different species. So this is the same hoverfly species as on the previous slide, and the reason for showing it is that well, it's a bit of silliness on my behalf. You'll you'll see that the face of the hoverfly has a remarkable resemblance to a Great St Bernard dog. I'm not, of course, suggesting this is any sort of mimicry, but I had to show it. Going back to being serious again about the same species of hoverfly, looking at the trends, there is an interesting trend apparent in the map on the right of the UK. Let's ignore the records in Scotland because there's been uneven intent level of recording, but looking at England, where there's a more consistent level of recording, it's apparent that you've got the sort of mauve and purple colours predominantly along the south coast from East Anglia down to southwest England. So those are declines, and yet over most of the rest of England it's fairly static. So it does imply a northward movement of this species, probably because of climate change. This is another hoverfly in the same genus, and it's got a somewhat similar appearance to the previous one, and it's rather localized, which means it's not very common at all, but it's not rare. And you see that it likes woodland edges and umbellifers. And this one has had a substantial range shift from the southeast, where it used to be present, and it's tended to be more common in parts of western Scotland, as I'll show you from the following map. Best to ignore the top two maps and concentrate on the lower two. The one on the left shows the older records from 1980 to 1999, and you can see that as it was absent from large parts of eastern England and East Anglia, but now it's also disappeared more or less from southeast England, parts of central southern England, some parts of the West Country, but it's also apparent that it's become significantly more common in parts of western Scotland and southwest Scotland. So that's probably a range shift in its typical location, because the climate probably doesn't suit it anymore. Maybe it changes in habitat as well. So this slide just shows you a close-up of that species browsing on umbellifers. So the next little section is on courtship leading up to mating. Some hoverflies are territorial. Males set up territories around a patch of flowers and fight off rivals, which requires a lot of energy, of course. And some don't have territories, but line up. For instance, what I'm going to show you actually, in an attempt to mate with a female, or cruise around looking for likely females. So different species tend to do it in different ways. Now here is what you might call a line-up with this particular species, Erysilis nemorum, and the buttercup has one female on it, the one right at the bottom, and then the ones 1, 2, 3 actually shown, but I think there were several more, but I couldn't get them all in the same picture, stacked up vertically, loosely anyway. It's not easy to tell from a photograph like this, but they're just sort of lining up to grab their chance while the female carries on oblivious, perhaps, I'm not sure, to the situation, feeding on the buttercup. Here's a different sort of situation where you've got the female feeding on a knapweed, and the other one that's not in focus is in fact above it and just passed by and disappearing again. So that looks likely to be one that's just cruising around looking for something to mate with and decided, well, that's the wrong species, which it is, and just passes on. So that's just looking for something to mate with. Well, you can see straight away that this looks somewhat odd. It doesn't look right, does it? At the bottom, you've definitely got a female. And then above that, in the middle, it's probably a male, but I can't be 100% sure because the one at the top has got its front legs over the eyes of the one in the middle, so you can't tell whether the eyes are separated or joined together. So that really does confuse you, but likely as not it's two males and one female. Well, that's never going to work, is it? Not really. One's getting in the way of the other. This particular species, well, it's actually a genus because it consists of several really minute species. They're only about 3 or 4 millimeters long, and actually little is known about them, and they can be easily confused with small solitary wasps and move about in a similar way. This is another odd one, but in a different sort of way. The species identification is speculative because it is incredibly difficult with this genus to identify them without microscopic identification, checking of the genitalia. But anyway, be that as it may, I've never seen hoverflies doing this rather than the usual sort of one on top of the other. They're doing it end to end, facing away from each other, and they happen to be on a builder's bucket, curiously. Anyway, it takes all sorts, and I'm not sure whether that's going to work or not. And this is a real close-up of the genitalia where they're joined for mating. And again, it's not really possible to be 100% certain that you can identify it as one particular species. This is now back to conventional mating as it's normally done with another species entirely unrelated, mating on tansy, as I would put. The male in this species has got really big eyes. You can see the depth of them is really quite significant. And they've also got enlarged facets at the front, which may help in enhancing its forward binocular vision. These hoverflies are exceptionally good at manoeuvring, and actually worth commenting that in some years there's an apparent explosion in numbers which may imply a mass long distance migration from the continent. Just a reassurance that this is how it's normally done with hoverflies, yet another species, and yet another example of how it's done. Moving on to the consequence of that, egg laying or ovipositing. This is quite interesting, and I've got an interesting example coming up. So we have Aristolis nemorum hoverfly, which I just happened to be taking a photograph of for identification, and it very kindly demonstrated how egg laying occurs. So I've got a series of photographs showing the various stages, and I'll move to the next slide. So you can now see a segmented projection from the end of the abdomen. It's definitely got subtle marks of segments, and it's normally tucked within the abdomen in normal life. And then it extends a bit further, and you can see that something's happening at the extreme apex. It's not quite obvious what is happening at that point. And then from the segmented section you have a yellow cylinder, which I assume is the actual egg laying part of the anatomy. And it extends even further down towards the leaf. So this is the ovipositor with its segments and the yellow tube extending out from that, and that's about as far as it goes. I haven't actually got pictures of the subsequent eggs laid. I have tried to investigate the anatomy of the ovipositor because I haven't seen any pictures like this, and I couldn't find anything on the web, so it's all a bit of an obscure mystery as to what the parts are called and how this varied between different species. I think it's an area which is really not very much known about. Now this is a species that I've already shown you a few images of and its distribution and so forth. You can see from this one that it has got an unnatural looking extension from its abdomen, and that is the start of the ovipositor part of the anatomy coming out. Whether it's actually been egg laying or about to, of course I don't know, because I've only got that one photograph. Another example of a hoverfly, in this case it clearly looks distended with eggs within its abdomen. You can see that it's swollen underneath, and it's a female, and it's got its ovipositor sticking out, very apparent on the left but subtly on the right, and the abdomen is obviously distended on that one more obviously, and that's called gravid when it's full of eggs and wants to lay. And it's interesting that it's on a grass obviously, and this hoverfly is normally found in grassland, quite a common one, extending even onto moorland and mountainsides. Within Europe there is some evidence that there are several species, but I'm not sure that that is taken as accepted within this country. Anyway, the interest is also in the fact that the distribution of this is changing, even though it's very common. Looking at the map on the left, it's more or less covered in quite a dark red circle. So it's common, but you can see that in various places you can see orange, which is much older records that haven't been superseded by modern records. So the distribution is becoming subtly more patchy. It's obviously starting to fade away from being very common. And the graph on the right shows accumulation of that within numbers that's showing an overall trend. And you can see that it's got this curious double dip, but it's significantly declining. I'll probably mention the double dip further on. Dealing with a few peripheral issues that people might ask questions about, like how long do they live and how many broods they have in a year. Well, flight periods vary according to different species, and they'll tend to be several broods in a year, but some only perhaps have one, and some will come out really early and some will come out later, and so on. But they do tend to have within one species a particular preferred area where the mating and broods take place. Longevity is tricky. You can't exactly attach tags to hoverflies, can you, and then see when they die. You can't ring them, but it's thought that they'll last several weeks, obviously depending on what's happening to them. Some obviously get battered and bits of wing missing after a time. It's really quite tricky, and some appear to last through the winter because you'll actually see them in the winter. The only ways they could have got to that stage was actually by lasting several months. So I think there are some unknowns here. This is an area perhaps where even less is known. The larval forms a really obscure area, and there are very few people in the country that know much about it and are able to identify a hoverfly from its larval form. Vary a great deal, the habitat requirements, where you might find larvae. I'd be very lucky if you do find any, but you can see I've listed the various greatly varying particular habitat requirements. And then I mentioned that not all larva species eat aphids, and sometimes it's caterpillars, and some just eat small prey. So this is an example of the larval form of a particular hoverfly species. Looking closely at it, aligned diagonally, the top left, as it were, towards the apex, you can see two tiny projections, and those are its breathing tubes, which is quite a giveaway as to what it actually is. Here's another example, a rather different looking larval form with a very spiky outline. Looks quite fiercely defensive in that not much is going to tackle that. And again, you can see at the bottom in this case, it's got a breathing tube split into two halves at the extreme apex, and that actually was identifiable, and it will emerge as an adult in that hoverfly form on the right. So this is a third example of a hoverfly larval form. You might wonder why I think it's a hoverfly larva. Well, I'll explain in a moment, but it's fairly subtle that you can see at the left hand end of the body it looks like two breathing tubes of sort of slightly brownish tan coloured blobs, and otherwise it doesn't look very rigid in its structure, no sort of defensive spikes or what have you. and somewhat opaque surface, but you can see through what's beneath. And then the giveaway is the fact that it's actually eating an aphid at the other end. So I think that's pretty conclusive to me. That is a hoverfly larval form, but impossible to identify it properly. So obviously we move on to aphids, which is the biggest single source of food for the larval form of hoverflies. And here you have a white currant leaf, and it looks crinkly, or to a gardener would think, oh dear, there's something wrong here. It's obviously infested with something, and indeed it is. So on the underside, there it is. There's the cause of the problem. It's the red currant aphid. Those top left are both obvious aphids that are alive, and then bottom right you can see some sort of skeletonized remains of aphids, and then there's something else that doesn't look like an aphid, and that is a hoverfly larva. Here's another example on the underside of a plum tree, on the underside of the leaf, and these are the mealy plum aphids. Well, this is interesting for another reason, and the interesting reason is that these aphids are attended by ants, black ants of some sort. There's a huge collection on the upper quadrant of that leaf, but on the lower part you've got two adults that are actually laying live aphids, and you can actually see them emerging both, and the ant is interested in attendance, and the benefit for the ants is that they get honeydew, and you can actually see a blob of honeydew on that upper quadrant of the leaf. Here's a successive photograph from this particular situation where you can see that the two aphids at the bottom are still producing live adults. That's a peculiar thing about aphids. And then the ant in attendance on the other aphids. And then you can see middle rightish, that looks yet again like the larval form of a hoverfly. And here is a magnification of a previous image, and you can see quite clearly that the larval form of hoverfly of some species is actually eating a tiny aphid. Dealing with the migration aspect of hoverfly lives, quite a few species are known to migrate, as in quite significant distances and probably from the continent. And there are many unknowns, of course, about hoverfly migration. Because they're so small, you can't study them like birds, or more feasibly still, you could study butterflies and migrations, but hoverflies are really a bit too small to study. But there are potential migrants around, and I'll show you a few examples. Here is a good example, Scaeva pyrastri. It is believed that it is not a resident hoverfly, but arrives as a migrant from the continent and breeds here, and it may sometimes overwinter. Yearling numbers vary wildly. I haven't seen one, or at least much of one, for a few years. The last time I think I saw one was in Wordsworth House in Cockermouth. Our latest species, Scaeva selenitica, and this is actually a rather rare species which is thought to be a partial migrant and mainly found in southern England. Now this hoverfly is the really common one. It does have an English name, and surprisingly it is thought to be a migrant, at least partially. It can overwinter in milder parts of the UK. And the final example of a migrant hoverfly, Sphaerophoria scripta. This is a male, and it's unusual. You can see it's got a really long abdomen, which is considerably longer than the wings. It belongs to a genus which are very difficult to identify, but this is probably the only one that you can actually say for definite, because it's got such a long abdomen compared with the wings. It is a fairly common hoverfly of grassland, and it may be an intermittent migrant and not normally resident in the far northwest of the UK. Habitat requirements for hoverflies. Immensely varied. I've already mentioned before in the larval form how they can be completely different from the adult requirements. So as I said, there's so many different types of suitable habitats for hoverflies, but some species are more generalist than others, as with many other things in life. Recognised preferential habitats include the following: mountains and moorland, Caledonian pine forests, old parkland, conifer plantations, dry grasslands, brownfield sites, and so on. Now, I'm not going to go through examples for all of those because I haven't got examples. I'm just going to deal with a very few from bogs and wetlands. Starting off with a rather striking looking hoverfly, a wasp mimic, I guess you could call it, Sericomia lepona. This is not a common hoverfly at all, even in boggy areas. I've rarely come across it, but it is generally widespread in northern and western UK and a few boggy heaths in the south of England. Well, this one, a very large hoverfly actually, is considerably more common. I even come across it in our garden normally several times a year. In this particular situation, it's rather curiously accompanied by a tiny ensign fly. They're the ones that have got clear wings except for a spot on them towards the tip, and they walk around waving them in the air, and hence the name ensign fly. So this one appears to be approaching what could be regarded as a wasp, so it's a pretty risky thing to do. And then the next thing the ensign fly does is, wisely if it was a wasp, is to turn around and disappear around the other side of the leaf. It's worth mentioning then that this hoverfly is generally seen in upland areas and boggy heaths and wet meadows, and you're more likely to find them in the northwest and the southeast of England. In the southeast it is actually quite rare. This one I regard as a bit of an oddity, Epistrophe grossularia. So I found it on bog asphodel in a wet flush in Dunnerdale, but the standard description is that it prefers umbellifers along woodland edges. So that's a bit odd in itself, and it's quite a local species in the UK. I suppose it's entitled to be where it likes, but in this case it doesn't seem to be quite fitting the rules. So I'm now going to show you a few hoverflies that haven't been fitted in for one reason or another so far, but are worth putting in because of interesting features or differences from normal, or well, multiple reasons really. So here we go. This one's got a rather superb name, Ripponensia splendens, and I think the splendens must be associated with the fact that it's got wonderful coloration with sort of mustardy, dark mustardy coloured eyes and a crimson purplish thorax and scutellum. They're quite amazing coloration there, and it's a species typically found in lush meadows, fens, woodland clearings, and most frequently found in southern England, and it's not common in Cumbria at all. Platycerus granditarsus, which is a rather superb name as well. It's unusual in that it is at least partly melanic, because you should be able to see through the wings to the fact that it has a mainly orange upper surface to the abdomen, but it's really quite dark. Probably it's not obviously completely melanic though. And the other interesting thing about it is that it's clearly got odd middle legs, and the front pair particularly with the projections out on the tarsi really make it quite different from other hoverflies. In fact, you can actually distinguish this one completely on the basis of the form of the front legs, and it is a male in that respect. The females don't have this feature, so it's to do with clasping and mating, as I understand it. And this one is often common in marshy meadows. And this is the female of the same species. This is typical coloration. That's not melanic at all. They're really bold orange reddish upper surface to most of the abdomen, and the male is not normally quite the same, but it's basically of the similar form. I just happened to caught this female in mid-flight, and it does illustrate how it should normally appear. A related species of hoverfly, Platycherus albuminus, in this case again it's a male, it's pretty dark, and this is how it normally is. And it's worth pointing out the front tarsi, which I've expanded there, and you can see it's got a particular form. All those subtle lines, actually you can align them with illustrations and determine that it is actually that species precisely. Now this is the female of that species, and it's very dull with greyish dust patches on a black background, and it looks like it's just about to oviposit on the upper surface of a leaf. This is where I depart from the normal theme of suggesting that it's a mimic of a bee or a wasp or what have you. Well, it looks more like many standard flies, like house flies of various sorts, that have the grey stripes on a black thorax. And what I'm suggesting is that actually it's pretending to be a fly, because in this sort of environment you would rarely find bees and wasps in boggy areas, and therefore it pays to pretend it's something else, or at least that's my suggestion. I'm not sure if anyone's going to back me up on that. But as you can see, it's found in a wet flush on bog asphodel. Here is another example of the same species of hoverfly on the left, and compare it with the right side, which is a muskid fly in the order Diptera, and you can see at least that the front half of the fly is very much the same as a hoverfly on the left, with the dark background and the grey dusting lines. The abdomen to the rear, of course, is rather different. But actually, the coloration on the hoverfly on the left is quite interesting. It's got a very dark green, if anything, abdomen, and very pale coloured hairs. And the larva of the hoverfly has been found in tree saproot wounds. Otherwise, it's again, with many hoverflies, it's a bit obscure. And as I said, I'm suggesting that it's an example of fitting with the crowd. I'm taking the risk of trying to pronounce this one, Miscellaneous sepulchralis. Unusual, isn't it, because of its spotted eyes. It's sort of very distinctive of the others in the genus. This makes it completely distinctive. And it's often found in lowland coastal locations around ponds and marshes. I've only come across it once, but the location precisely fits that. It's a bit difficult to say why I picked this one. It's got a strange sort of rubbery looking appearance, and a rather peculiar wrinkles around the head between the eyes. It's altogether a bit odd and doesn't look like a typical hoverfly at all. This one's typically found in bogs and wet acid pastures, and it's a very local species, so you won't often come across this one. So this is another hoverfly in the same genus. You can see the similarity, although this doesn't have that sort of quite that rubbery sort of appearance, but you can see the wrinkles of the surface between the eyes. And this one is considerably more common. It likes damp places, and it's widespread in the UK. Hogweed, angelica and water dropworts are where it can be found typically. This is one of those hoverflies that is an obvious clear-cut case of a wasp mimic. They're really quite striking. There's quite a few in this surface genus, but they are really tricky to identify. They're so similar you really need a specimen to look at under a microscope. But this one is distinctive. Fortunately, it's a male because the eyes are close together, touching rather. It's got hairy eyes, and that's the giveaway. It's one of the few that can be identified in this by photos alone. Thank goodness there's something that can be done that way. Yet again, a hoverfly with a distinctive wasp mimic type appearance on the abdomen, and I've only come across this once. it is supposedly widespread but rarely abundant species, and it prefers margins of lowland woods, which is actually where I found it. And in Cumbria it is considerably more common in inland areas, which perhaps explains why I haven't found it anywhere else. To start off with, I'm going to say I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the scientific name, but the sensu stricto appendage means that it is precisely this species and not a similar one or two which are difficult to separate without microscopic or subtle features. There's also a sensu lato description where you effectively merge several species because you can't separate them. Now this one is interesting in that it's found normally south of a line from the Wash to Aberystwyth, and it's scarce in northern England. Well, I did find this in Cumbria. In fact, I think I found several examples in Cumbria, and it's associated with wasteland and various other similar sort of habitats where there are plenty of flowers. And it's interesting to compare it with the next one. So this one is in the same genus. It's very similar but readily distinguishable by the features that you can see in this photograph. And it's much less common, even in the south. This is a real rarity. I think I've only found this one once, but it's interesting that it's related to habitats that include limestone or chalk or what have you, that sort of substrate, which therefore limits its distribution in the UK. And if we can see the problem with climate change, it's not easy to move, is it? It's not easy to move to other areas because it probably in many cases involves significant leaps of a very significant distance, and therefore species like this are going to have a problem with adapting to climate change. Another very unusual hoverfly for two reasons. One is its appearance in being pretty much matte black with massive amounts of puncturation, those little pits in the abdomen, plus short white hairs. It really is an oddball, but it's distinguished, as you can see in the photograph bottom left, by the particular form of its hind femur, which has got a huge change in its width as it approaches the apex of it. So this, as I've said, is widespread but local in southern England, but I've found it at least once in a nice little ancient bit of woodland in southwest Cumbria. And this shows you the distribution in the map on the right, and also the trend on the left of significantly declining. Once again, it's got a sort of suggestion of a double dip decline with a stabilisation around 2000. And the map, the darker reds show more recent observations, so it is pretty sparse in northern England, and in fact most of the blobs in northern England are orange, which means they're quite old records. So that was a very good find actually. This is probably the most unusual hoverfly I've found. By chance really, I found it dead on the living room floor, so I didn't need to kill it, because with the unusualness of this, nobody would have believed me if I didn't have a specimen to say this is it. Well, this is precisely it, and you can't disprove it because I've been tampering with the photographs or something. And its status in the UK is unclear. It may be a vagrant associated with conifer plantations and aphids on spruce, otherwise known as the Lapland hoverfly. And going on to the details, this is the distribution. On the left are the more modern records, say typically post 2010, so a few random dots around the country. And on the right you've got typically rather older records. Again, there are very few, but then probably not many people recording, and maybe it's become more common, who knows. It's very difficult when something is as unusual as this to come to many conclusions. You need more observations, greater length of observation to see any trends. And well, it's amazing that I found it, and I just thought it was a dead hoverfly, and I thought it was worth checking, and it was worth checking. Well, I'll leave you with the message on the left to read at your leisure, as the image of hoverflies gradually fades away as they are in reality. This is the tragedy of the situation. And I think there needs to be a tremendous amount more collective action and concern about what's happening to things like this. Hoverflies, it represents what's happening to many insects, and they're so vital to the health of our environment. And look what's happening to them. We must try and alter the way we treat our environment.